and welcome to the first session of our new series, City Summit of the Americas, University Office Hours. Today's topic, Subnational Diplomacy 101. What is it and why does it matter? I'm Fritz Mayer. I'm the Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver. I'm really proud to be hosting this series. For those of you who don't know, the University of Denver is situated right next to the Rocky Mountains in beautiful Denver. And the Korbel School is a fabulous place founded in 1964 by Joseph Korbel, who was a Czech diplomat, a refugee who came to America, also known as the father of Madeleine Albright, our beloved Madeleine, whose passing we still mourn. Korbel was also the mentor of Condoleezza Rice, and so we're very proud to be so closely associated with the first two women secretaries of state here at the Korbel School. We're home to 7 master's programs and 2 undergrad programs. Shameless plug, we're still accepting applications to our master's program. So if you have an interest, please do look us up. I should, before going any further, we always like to acknowledge that we, even though we're virtual, we are coming to you from a place that sits on the land, the ancestral land of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. And we recognize and honor the, well, frankly, sometimes very troubled history of the region and the ways in which this land was expropriated from the native inhabitants. So we honor both their memory and the native peoples still residing in Colorado in the Mountain West. So thanks for being with us today as we begin this series. This April, the U.S. Department of State and the City of Denver will host city leaders from throughout the Americas for the first ever City Summit of the Americas, demonstrating the importance of local communities and their capacity for positive impact. The City Summit will provide new opportunities for communities big and small to build stronger relationships across the Western Hemisphere. The inaugural City Summit will in turn convene subnational leaders with diverse and inclusive representatives of government, civil society, business, academia, youth, culture, and the arts, and indigenous and underrepresented groups. Concurrent to the City Summit of the Americas, the U.S. Department of State and the City of Denver will also host the City Summit of the Americas for Youth. The Youth Summit is a 3-day government policy and innovation summit for young people, engaging youth with city leaders, entrepreneurs, policy experts, and social activists from around the Western Hemisphere. The Youth Summit will offer opportunities for networking and skills building to spark critical conversations and take action on pressing hemispheric issues. The goal of the Youth Summit is to strengthen regional dialogue while inspiring the next generation of world changers. More information and registration for the Youth Summit can be found on citysummitoftheamericas.org. So, what are we doing today? The University Office Hours will bring the central themes of the City Summit directly to student audiences. Our participants will discuss central themes of the City Summit alongside regional experts, including U.S. State Department representatives, members of civil society, and academics. Our first session today, as I said, is on the basics of subnational diplomacy in dealing with pressing global challenges. The following 4 sessions will feature the role of subnational diplomacy and the main themes of the City Summit, including climate change mitigation and adaptation, cultural preservation and economic development, migration, and disinformation in elections. We will then conclude the series with a deep dive into opportunities for youth engagement, both at the City Summit and within your surrounding communities. Featuring government leaders and regional experts, we hope you will join us as we explore local solutions to global challenges. Well, let me introduce our panelists. Joining us today, first let me introduce Willow Fortunoff. Willow is an assistant director at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsht Latin American Center, where she manages programming on local diplomacy and engagement. She co-developed the center's congressional outreach strategy and frequently works with congressional offices to support bipartisan U.S. policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean. Willow co-led the implementation of the 9-month Summit of the Americas project in partnership with the U.S. Department of State. Prior to joining the Atlantic Council, she worked on the Congressional Affairs team at the German Marshall Fund. Willow has also worked on several political campaigns in Vermont and Minnesota, and is a 2020 Truman Scholar from Vermont. Welcome, Willow.
Thank you so much, Dean Fritz Mayer. It's such a pleasure to be here.
And also joining us shortly will be Ambassador Nina Hachigian. Ambassador Hachigian is the first U.S. Special Representative for Subnational Diplomacy. I look forward to hearing about that role. Before joining the department, she served as the first Deputy Mayor for International Affairs for the City of Los Angeles. In that role, she oversaw efforts that sent underserved community and college students on free educational international trips, created a new public-private partnership to attract international business and nonprofits, especially to underserved communities, prepared the city for the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games and their legacy, hosted the Summit of the Americas, founded the first global gender equity city network, planned trade missions, and worked with international city networks to advance cutting-edge climate change programs, migrant integration, healthy cities, and more. From 2014 to 2017, Ambassador Hachigian served as the second U.S. ambassador to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. During her tenure, she was awarded the State Department's Superior Honor Award for her service. She's also a founder of WASA, W-A-S-A, Women Ambassadors Serving America, and of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. Earlier, Ambassador Hachigian was a senior fellow and senior vice president at the Center for American Progress. Prior to that, the ambassador was a director of the RAND Center for Asia Pacific Policy for 4 years, and she served on the staff of the National Security Council in the Clinton White House from 1998 to 1999. We're experiencing a little technical difficulty getting her in, and so we will welcome her shortly, but it's great to have you, Willow, with us right now. So what we're going to do is this will be primarily about student questions, and we invite all of you in the audience to submit your questions. We're going to begin with 2 of our students from the University of Denver. And so I will invite first Laura Smalley and Kelvin Nascimento Camargo to ask the first round of questions to our panelists. Lauren is a master's candidate. Welcome, Lauren and Kelvin. Lauren is a master's candidate in global economic affairs at the Corbell School, specializing in Latin America. She's recently returned from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, obviously, where she studied international relations at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio. We also welcome Laurel. And we also Kelvin with us today. Kelvin's a master's candidate of international development here at the Corbell School, specializing in political economy. Originally from Brazil, he holds a bachelor's degree in public policy management from the University of Sao Paulo, and has work experience with public education in the city and state of Sao Paulo. So thank you, Kelvin, for being with us. So let me turn to you, Laurel, first.
Yes, thank you, Dean, for the amazing introduction. And I appreciate all of you panelists here. We appreciate your time, and we're so thankful to have this discussion today. Again, I want to invite all the participants to submit their questions in the chat, as again, we are so excited to be discussing this important topic. So for starters, Ambassador Hachigian and Willow, welcome. And the first question is as follows. In an increasingly interconnected global environment, cities, municipalities, counties, and states across the Western Hemisphere are on the front lines of the most pressing global issues. What role does the Special Representative for Subnational Diplomacy play in developing robust solutions for these global challenges? And also as a follow-up, how might greater coordination between local governments across the Americas advance U.S. Department of State regional priorities?
Right. Let me just welcome the ambassador. Thank you. I know we had some technical difficulties, but thank you so much for being with us today. Well, I introduced you before, so I won't do that again. But anyway, welcome. And I'll let you, perhaps you'll take the first crack at those questions.
Sure, and thank you. Apologies to the students for my technical problems, but we solved them. And solving problems is something that the State Department does every day, solving global problems that affect Americans back here at home. And what's so exciting to me about this position is that it's connecting the problem solving that happens in cities every day with the problem solving that we're doing at the global stage. So you've experienced it yourself, during the pandemic, but on all kinds of transnational issues that cross borders and affect our populations back home. We have the State Department is working on those throughout the world. And and cities and governors or mayors and governors are working on them here at home. So that could be, cyber attacks or migration issues or and many others that that are transnational in nature. Drug flows, trafficking in persons. And so it's really two sides of these same problems. And my office is bridging the divide between those so that we can take the learnings of governors and mayors who are facing these issues on the street and bring them to the State Department. We have a few teams in the State Department who really want want to shape global treaties by talking to cities and states about their experiences, on their end, like during the pandemic, for example. And there's just many issues, and climate change is probably the one that illustrates this the most clearly, that if you're trying to solve climate change on a global scale, you have to enlist the efforts of cities and states because they're often the ones that control the levers of carbon. So when you think about a mayor, for example, who decides whether or not to put public transportation in their city, who is in charge of how to power the grid in their city and chooses renewables or not renewables. And I could go on and on. So that's really what this office is trying to do. And in terms of the Western Hemisphere, maybe I'll save it till a little later to talk about the City Summit of the Americas, but that's really going to be a historic and super interesting thing that's going to be happening in Denver.
Well, thanks for that. We will come back to the City Summit of the Americas. So it is very exciting. Willow, your thoughts on that question?
Thank you so much. And thank you again to the University of Denver and the U.S. Department of State for this invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here. Subnational diplomacy is so exciting for me, and I think probably so exciting for the students and professors on this call who will play such a crucial role in both identifying the research and kind of the best practices that will help mayors and governors across the U.S. engage internationally. I really, really appreciate Ambassador Hachigian's comments, completely agree, and I think probably most people here today have heard President Biden describe his goal about creating a foreign policy for the middle class. And clearly, subnational diplomacy is really one of the most effective ways to do so because it allows middle class communities across the Americas to shape their foreign policy that best serves them. I think Ambassador Hachigian brought up a number of really crucial topics. I think the one that I probably work on the most in my experience with the Atlantic Council is migration. Looking at how communities on both sides of the border are engaging on a daily basis on topics of commercial flows, security, things that affect their constituents and their communities, and recognizing that this is a kind of a practical priority, not necessarily a partisan priority. So I think seeing how these local leaders drive daily cooperation focused on practical needs that are consistently in line with U.S. Department of State priorities as announced at the Summit of the Americas and referenced by Ambassador Hachigian's point about the City Summit, which is kind of a natural continuation that builds the local continuation of each 9th Summit deliverable.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. Kelvin, your questions.
Thank you, Fritz. So my question is similar to Laura's question. So we have some recent examples in the Americas of interactions between local governments and countries regarding important policy issues. Some famous ones are related to local governments negotiating support for vaccines purchase or environmental protection. So you have, for example, the Brazilian examples of São Paulo trying to negotiate with China for vaccines, and the state of Amazonas trying to negotiate with European countries for environmental protection funds. And sometimes these initiatives, they go to the opposite side, to the opposite direction of their federal government approach. So you have the lower federal level going to one direction and the federal one going to the opposite one. So in this sense, what has been the role of subnational diplomacy in reshaping countries' strategic policies? And if I can add something with that, how can we prevent subnational diplomacy of being seen as a political threat to a higher level, a higher federal level in this scenario? Thank you.
It's a really interesting question. And let me do what I should have maybe done at the beginning. Let me step back for a second and tell you what the 3 roles of my new office are. And then I'll try to tackle that question, which is a tricky one. So first, we are trying to connect the benefits of our broader American foreign policy with governors and mayors in the United States. So that could be trade and investment opportunities. It could be, trying to, clear a visa problem that might exist. It could be connecting students with the kind of exchange programs that exist. That kind of a thing. Second is to encourage mayors and governors in the United States to do more internationally, because we have this paradox in this country where on the one hand, compared to other regions in the world, especially our cities are not as engaged internationally, except for a few exceptions. But we're such a big country that there's actually a lot of international activity that goes on. And, oftentimes we're able to provide advice or connections. We get inquiries, every day from mayors and governors who would like to, they're going on a trade mission and they want to be connected to the embassy, or they are, planning to welcome a delegation and want to know, what our relationship with that country is, that kind of thing. And then finally, we are the part of the State Department that helps the entire State Department think about subnational issues. And I gave you the example of climate change. So there are countries in which at the national level, they're not really going in the direction of climate, of renewables, or, they're just pure kind of oil and gas. But then at the subnational level, there might be leaders who really want to decarbonize and want to put in solar panels to power their, their city's grid, et cetera. So this is a kind of a natural thing for there to be, some differences between what cities want to do and what the federal level wants to do. I mean, we're still in the United States kind of at the earlier stages. And so right now we're a resource for cities and for states who want to do more, and we are encouraging them to do that and giving them briefings on different topics. With the State Department's full of experts on everything and every region, so we're doing a lot of that. We have a lot of programs to connect, maybe not a lot, but we do have programs to connect cities in the United States with cities internationally. And that technical assistance sharing, which we haven't really talked about yet, is really important. So you mentioned Brazil. And so I know, for example, that Los Angeles is putting in bus rapid transit lines, which is something they learned from Brazil, from a Brazilian city. And there's just a bazillion examples of that. When mayors get together, it tends not to be political. It tends to really just be, I want to learn how to do this thing better. And in the US as well, at the mayoral level, many elections are not partisan at all. They're non-partisan elections. You don't have, the two parties running against each other. It's just whoever's, kind of best for the job. But I think that tension is natural. And in the US anyway, cities and states have a wide latitude to do, what they think is right for their people. And, there are federal, authorities, obviously, when it comes to defense and when it comes to, binding treaties. but there's not a lot to, there's not a lot of constrictions around what states and cities do. But at the moment, we're just providing advice and guidance when folks want that.
Yeah, and I can build on that excellent point. Of course, federal law requires the State Department to publish all international agreements, to which is party online. You have hearings, congressional hearings on this, but states don't actually have to share this online or don't engage with any branch of Congress in the same way, which I think is an excellent opportunity for universities and professors and students to really get involved and help bridge this gap in reliable information. Because without this information on how each state is engaging internationally, we don't really know what approaches are working and which states need more support. So I think that's an excellent way just to fill in some of those gaps. And then to kind of the first part of your point, Kelvin, which I think is a really nuanced and excellent point. I think that in healthy democracies, locally elected officials are really the most direct connection to people. So in many ways, the policy objectives that they share represent the needs of their communities. And the US is an enormous country, and oftentimes our federal bureaucracy can work a little bit slowly. And so local leaders can actually take action a little bit more adroitly. I know that when Mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti, really referenced this point during the COVID-19 pandemic, how they were able to just marshal resources at a much quicker rate, just given their size. And so it's more of a practical issue. And so I guess in that sense, I would say that local leaders can help drive the agenda for national leaders by kind of signaling the needs of local communities before they even show up in national polls or electoral trends. So climate is obviously a huge example there, but you can think of it as a wish ball or a fortune teller that kind of can predict trends that are coming before they're very obvious in the rest of the country.
That's great. Well, and thank you for that. And thank you, Laurel and Kelvin, for getting us, kicking us off today with those great questions. Before we move on, let me encourage all of you in the audience to put your questions in the Q&A. We really would like to hear from you. We have a substantial audience, which I'm delighted about. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box. Let me just follow up. This is such a fascinating conversation, and the role of cities and other subnational entities in policy is it's ever more important. And so very interesting that we're not just talking about it, but that there's a new unit at the State Department, and this is increasingly an important part of the agenda. One of the questions we've gotten, though, expands that even further, and it's really about the relationship between governments, the private sector, academia, nonprofits, the multi-sectoral nature. So more and more policy is not just about government-to-government interactions or the role of government more generally, but also involves all sectors in lots of ways. And I wonder if the two of you could say a few words about the roles of the other sector, the ways in which government, academia, civil society, and the private sector might engage, as part of this subnational phenomenon. Who would like?
You want to go first this time?
Yeah.
Yes, happy to kick things off. I can focus specifically on the role of a lot of subnational organizations, which really has represented one of the I would say largest trends in subnational engagement, kind of in the early 2000s. So obviously, subnational diplomacy is not a new topic. It's not a new initiative. These conversations have really been growing, I would say, since the 1950s, when Eisenhower first really established and highlighted sister city relationships. So I would say while these relationships used to be kind of more of a bilateral nature, so twinning or sister agreements between cities, they recently have become much more network oriented, I think due in part to the wonderful work of organizations who are working to bring together mayors, typically on thematic priorities. So I think one approach that has been proven to be incredibly successful is to rally mayors around a priority that's in their area and that can be supported through mass action. So I think C40 is probably the largest example. It's a network of the major cities committed to addressing climate change, and they work on sustainable action plans aligned with the Paris Agreement. But there's also really phenomenal work, networks such as Strong Cities Network, which work on addressing polarization and extremism in mayors and in local communities, and organize convenings with mayors across the world, over Zoom or in person. The German Marshall Fund Cities program does really wonderful work connecting city directors, international affairs. And I think all of these nonprofit initiatives demonstrate that a lot of times mayors and governors don't have the capacity as of now to really lead this on their own. So, you know, a mayor of a local town has 100 priorities. Most of them are domestic. Most of them focus on the community. And of course, to then have that international approach, sometimes it requires additional resources, trainings, connections that other organizations have really stepped up and provided. So that's just a little note to that point, and I'm sure Ambassador Hachigian can fill in more from her perspective.
Yeah, it's a really important point that Willow highlights. These networks are very powerful, and they exist at the state level too. I was talking recently with the Under 2 Coalition, which is similar to the C40 that it works on climates, but it's got partner regions and provinces all around the world, all working to to decarbonize and share their lessons and how to do that best. So that's some of the examples of nonprofit organizations, and there's lots of think tanks in Washington that also advise and have various projects that are supporting city and state diplomacy and the State Department. And the private sector is hugely important. There's in solving problems, they're obviously critical. And there's another part of the State Department, my sort of sister counterpart that works with the private sector on all kinds of things, innovation, entrepreneurship, and solutions when it comes to the kind of emerging technologies that can be helpful in solving problems. So that's the private sector. When it comes to academia and universities, like the research that universities have done about cities and about states and their international role has been really informative to me. I remember when I was deputy mayor and we were trying to measure the results, measure the progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals, which are these 17 goals that the world came together and established that we're all going to try to reach by 2030. And we had student teams from a local university, each take a goal and find the data, and we used all that, all their work to help us create a dashboard. So we involved student, research teams directly in our work, and I think there's probably a lot of opportunity for that, because as Willow points out, most cities and towns and counties and states don't have folks who are focused internationally for the most part, and so I think academia might be able to fill in the gap at times with knowledge and with research and with ideas.
So thank you for that. Yeah, it's fascinating to see the ways in which all these networks and all these different actors are how to arrange that in a way that we all pull them more or less in the same direction to solve problems. We're getting some great questions now from our audience. Thank you, all of the in the audience for those. Let me take some of these. So one is that does the State Department perceive subnational diplomacy as a driver for democracy, which of course is a priority for the Biden administration and for the State Department around the world. How can subnational diplomacy fit into that effort to promote democracy?
Yeah, I really think that there's a role for subnational diplomacy in preserving democracy and hopefully reversing the slide that we've had around the world toward more authoritarian models. And that's by delivering well. When cities and states deliver services that their citizens and residents need without corruption and in a timely way, that proves and shows that democracy can work. And so that's I think just a baseline kind of critical function. And then there are situations around the world where you have subnational leaders who are hanging on to preserving individual rights for people and fighting climate change, and preserving rights for minorities, and that can be within the context of a more authoritarian leaning national government. So we see those cases as well.
Yeah. Willow, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I can highlight a really wonderful initiative that came out of that point that Ambassador Hachigian's making about local leaders kind of forging solidarity as they're on the front lines of some of the erosion of democratic norms and principles. So, of course, there was the Pact of Free Cities, which was started by mayors in Eastern Europe, focused on democracy and how to kind of strengthen their democratic systems. And that eventually led into the Global Declaration of Mayors for Democracy, which is, as the name implies, now a global level initiative that really focuses on banding together and having the solidarity even in tense national environments. And I think looking at the context of the Americas, how could this solidarity and collaboration help mayors in more closed societies, Nicaragua, Venezuela, or Cuba, really learn from this approach to subnational solidarity and help each other by learning from leaders in Eastern Europe. I think there's a lot of really innovative lessons and ideas there.
Yeah, and I will say that we're encouraging any mayors who might be listening to sign that Global Declaration on Democracy, and you can find it at the German Marshall website, and the / is Mayors for Democracy, and you can see there's about 100 mayors who have signed on so far.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for that information. It is, as was mentioned earlier, we live in a time of, in this country and throughout the hemisphere, indeed throughout the world, high levels of political polarization. And one of the things is, I think, Madam Ambassador, you mentioned is the ways in which, it's much more likely that mayors, city officials are, problem solving oriented, often a good deal less partisan. Is that as sort of a important element of the ways in which cities can play an important role in building democracy and kind of healthier systems of government?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The mayor that I worked for often said that he would go to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which is a big annual event in Washington. And actually our Secretary of State spoke there for the first time this January. So he was the first one to ever do it. But he said anyway that he would go to these events and he would be talking with someone and have no idea what party they were from. They would just be, talking about the kind of, asphalt that the special asphalt that they use that reflects the rays instead of absorbing the rays, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Switch to another question here from the audience, which is just asking, can you give an example of a collaborative cross-city or local effort that's had a large international impact? Which of you might want to highlight an example?
I think climate is probably the best example, where you have cities that are sharing their technical expertise on all kinds of different projects related to sustainability. And you have various networks that are kind of collecting that knowledge, and they have their own experts. So ICLEI is one group, C40, as mentioned, Willa mentioned, U2. So they all are kind of sharing cross-border lessons and all kind of racing to decarbonize. And I'll say that at COP26, C40, and in this case, the mayor that I worked for was the chair of the time, brought the commitments of over 1,000 cities that they were going to reach the net zero by 2050 goal that has been set, and then they'll have their reductions or their fair share of reductions by 2030. And that was probably the largest national government commitment, and that was all done by cities. So I think that's probably the best example.
Yeah.
Nina, I want to make sure we talk about the city summit before.
I'm going to get to
ready.
I'll let I don't know, Willow, if you had an example, and then I do want to ask about the city summit, and we'll find out what it is and what's happening, and what people can, how the people might engage in it with it. So, but Willow, your thoughts on this? Any examples come to mind?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that I think also these kind of cross-border examples of collaboration are a way for local leaders to express their values on a global stage, which I think has immense importance at this moment. So Ambassador Hachigian really referenced the climate collaboration here, and how after the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, there was a lot of tension over what that might mean for the future of international climate negotiations. And I think the way that local leaders stepped up kind of was a way of showing their values and showing that this focus on climate would remain on the agenda across the United States. And I think other city networks do that. So we've referenced a number, but there's also one that I think is really impactful, which is the City Hub and Network for Gender Equity. So looking at how mayors can advance and really take a stand to show their commitment to advancing gender equity across their city. So it's a way of really showing what a city stands for, and then helping the constituents feel part of that envisioned goal and priority, which I think is a pretty meaningful thing.
Yeah, indeed. Great examples. Okay. City Summit of the Americas. First one, where there have been summits of the Americas, but this is the first City Summit of the Americas. All right. Why? What is it? What's happening? What will be happening here in Denver in April?
I'm just pretty excited about this because it's the first City Summit of the Americas, and I think it might be the first city summit that the State Department is involved with. I might be wrong about that, maybe back in the day at some point, but it's certainly the only one in recent history. So we are going to be gathering hundreds of leaders in Denver at the end of April, from across the entire hemisphere: mayors, governors, community leaders, private sector. And we're getting them together to discuss a range of issues that came out of the summit of democracies, which we had the pleasure of hosting in Los Angeles. And so the kinds of issues are democracy renewal, public health, climate change, migration, and more. And the idea is to connect these subnational leaders around those issues to create progress on them. And, as we've been talking about, sometimes that tangible progress is more easily found at the local level. So that's the idea. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun also. Mayors are often, fun folks to hang around with. They're optimistic, I think, for the most part, because why would you do that job, which is so hard, if you're not an optimistic person that you can make a difference? So it's really to put into the world the action around what the national leaders agreed to. And so, so that's the idea. We would love your students to be engaged. We can talk about how that happens if you want after that. Or after that.
And Willow, I know you were quite involved in the Summit of the Americas. What are your thoughts on the City Summit of the Americas?
Yeah, well, I definitely share Ambassador Hachigian's excitement. I think it was really wonderful to see Secretary Blinken announce this initiative at the summit in LA last year to kind of demonstrate the natural continuation to the City Summit. So really the local level implementation. And I think one more point that I'll add is that the agenda itself is really organized along thematic tracks to focus on these really practical priorities. I think we're going to see some really strong commitments and deliverables come out of this. So we already have a lot of mayors committed to attending. I think one point I'll flag is I believe that registration for other participants is open until March 15th. So you still have some time, but make sure to look into that. They have a really excellent City Summit of the Americas website that has all of the information on the agenda, outlines of key sections and key topics that'll be covered, and information on registration as well.
So that was the question, was how can students and in our audience and others get involved in the City Summit? Is that the best way to go to the website?
I can take that in just a second, but I wanted also to say that what's unique about this event is that we the various organizations that work with cities, and Willa mentioned some of them earlier, and I did as well. We brought them into to part of the planning process, because they're the ones who work with mayors day in and day out and know kind of where the conversations are, and what are the best ways in which to engage mayors. So we have a lot of these nonprofits that are kind of co-curating this event with us. So in terms of how to get involved, we would love to just see you in person on April 27th and 28th. We are going to be hosting a youth summit right downtown at the McNichols building in the Civic Center Park. So go to that website, it's citiessummitoftheamericas.org, and click on the youth tab to register for that summit. And for all the photographers out there, the website will also invite you to submit incredible shots of your local landscape to be featured at the city's summit. And you can join us for all sessions on the virtual series. So not just this one. The next one's going to be February 23rd. And the conversation will focus on mitigating and adapting to climate change, which is obviously a critical issue for the hemisphere, but also for the world. And for more information on the rest of the kind of virtual and in-person events, you can follow Summit of the Americas page at LinkedIn.
That's very helpful. And I think we had the URL in the chat for if any of you want to get it directly. I've looked, by the way, I've looked at the agenda. We've been, involved in some of those conversations you referenced, and it's really terrific. It's a really rich set of topics. And as you mentioned, all kinds of interesting partners being part of it. So it's really shaping up. So I think it's going to be very exciting. So I do encourage our students and everyone in the audience to take a look at the website and to get involved. Let me ask you one more question about the summit. What would success look like? How will you afterwards you say, wow, that was really great. How do you know what success is? Will you know what success is?
It's an excellent question. And to me, success is, mayors and governors finding out about ideas that they might not have tried before, but are useful to them. It would look like a recommitment to the principles and ideals that were agreed to at the Summit of the Americas. And across that kind of a range of issues. It would look like renewed or new kind of partnerships that particular cities develop around certain issues, and it would look for American mayors like they enjoyed this a bit, this, and for many it'll be relatively new, this opportunity to engage with others from around the world, and because they whenever I talk to mayors who've been in for the first time with international mayors, they often say, like, we just have the same exact problems. It might be at a different stage or whatever, but we're really trying to solve the same for the same things, which is basically improving the quality of life of our residents. So those are some of the things. I'd be curious to hear what Willow says.
Yeah, I certainly agree with all of those points. I'm sure there'll be a mix of obvious and then rather subtle successes that come out of this. And I think another one that I think of following our conversation so far is in the US and across the Americas is more additional offices and additional staffers focused on international engagement and really establishing these international connections. Because again, we spoke to sometimes the issue and capacity in local offices. And so I think it's wonderful to have this city summit, and it'll be equally impactful to have, the staff time and the resources to keep this on the agenda in the months and years to come. And so I think a key kind of metric or element of success that I would love to see in the coming year is how many mayors come out of the summit and then have someone on their team who's focused on international affairs in the years to come, or have someone from the community who's perhaps worked as a professor in international university in the past, or has that experience, who comes in to advise the mayor. So I would say building out kind of the support team to help mayors engage internationally would also be a huge success to come out of this.
Well, let's look forward to that, all of that happening. That's exciting. Willow, let me ask you a question. So as a more recent graduate, certainly than me, and young professional, from your position, what opportunities do you see for students to get involved in their local communities and advance subnational diplomacy priorities? I hate to ask you to speak for your generation, but how do you see your generation getting involved in this space?
Well, thank you so much. I think that really speaks to, my passion for this topic, for subnational engagement, and how I think it's really multidisciplinary. So it intersects interests in international law, sociology, urban resilience, urban planning, political science. I think essentially any interest you could have right now as a student could be beneficial to your mayor. So Ambassador Hachigian and I have been talking about capacity challenges in cities and how this is a growing trend, and a lot of mayors and governors are hoping to expand their approach to international engagement. And I think that students and professors can be empowered to be those advisors. I think the lessons that you're learning right now in school can be directly applicable for your local mayors and governors. And I think another really influential gift that this generation has is both on the digital front, so access to digital tools, which oftentimes are the bridge that connect mayors across the Americas. And additionally, I would say just the awareness of political shifts and political fluctuations. So a really interesting opportunity for engagement is, if you're working on a local campaign for a mayor, suggest they connect with diaspora communities and suggest that you can help influence their approach to international engagement. I think there's so many really exciting opportunities here, and university students and professors will play a really fundamental role in bridging this gap and helping their local officials become even more prepared.
Well, thank you for that. And there are probably lessons for those of us in academia to think about how we're preparing our students to engage in that world. So, I'll look forward to pursuing that conversation later. We're getting close to our allotted hour, which is all we have. Let me just ask each of you to say, to add any final closing thoughts that you might have. Maybe starting with you, Ambassador Hachigian.
Yeah, well, I'll say to your students, this is a really interesting and new career path in the United States to work with cities and states on their international engagement. It's very fulfilling. It's very practical. It's super interesting. You'll probably be starting from scratch, which is fun, I think, as someone who's done that a bunch of times. I will offer you some unsolicited career advice, which is to take risks and be really nice to everybody, because you never know when you're going to see them again. And to follow your interests, and that you don't necessarily need a career plan. I've never had one. I still don't have one. But that if you follow what's really interesting to you, and you keep up connections, that really helps. And I would encourage you to stay connected to the State Department. The State Department has a lot of really interesting exchange and other kinds of fellowship programs, and you can find them at exchanges.state.gov. The application deadline for one of them is in 2 days, so that's the wrangle. I'm sorry, it's the Gilman fellowship, which actually, no, I was right the first time. It's the Wrangell Summer Enrichment Program, and that is for it prepares undergraduates for careers in international affairs, and applicants from underrepresented communities with strong academic backgrounds are encouraged to apply. And then there's the Gilman one, which that deadline is March 9th. And then it goes on and on, but you can find all the information on our website, and would encourage you to apply for these great opportunities.
That's great. Very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. Willow.
Thank you so much. I think I'll quickly say that. So I myself studied political science and international relations in school. And I think initially I kind of had the sense that nearly all current and future global events could be understood through the lens of political and social theories that had already been conceptualized years ago. And I think what's been so fascinating for me about learning about and working on city and state diplomacy at the Atlantic Council has been the way that it's broken down and really challenged this assumption by revealing the multi-layered layers and levels of identity and citizenship that really influence these relationships across borders. So I'm from Vermont, and I've gotten to witness the ways in which Vermont's Black Lives Matter movement has showed solidarity across borders, while how our mayors have focused on practical issues such as river management and climate mitigation, learning lessons from other communities. And I think if it's a city, if it's a rural area, there are really tangible lessons that can be learned from this approach. And I really echo Ambassador Hachigian's comments about how this moment in time is unique. You know, this is the first time that Secretary of State has addressed mayors. It's the first time we're joined by someone with a title such as Special Representative for Subnational Diplomacy. First time, you know, beyond the US, the United Nations has institutionalized the role of mayors in the form of mayors as participants rather than observers. And so these ideas have been building. So many academics have been building on this work in previous years. And I think this is a really unique opportunity to get involved and to support these local initiatives, which is obviously exciting for me and exciting for Ambassador Hachigian. And hopefully this passion translates to people on the call as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for your passion. It is, you know, a moment where it's easy to sort of look at the world and see all the problems, and there are huge problems in the world. It is exciting and encouraging to have such enthusiasm for this really positive set of initiative and work that you're doing. So let me big thank you to both of you for your time today, and to those in the audience for your questions. We've had a great discussion, too short, of course, but certainly appreciate all of you who've joined us today for the first sessions of our City Summit of the Americas University Office Hours series. Corbell School with the U.S. Department of State will be hosting 5 additional sessions as part of this series leading up to the City Summit, held every other Thursday from 12 to 1, starting February 23rd. Our topics are those of the summit: climate change mitigation and adaptation on February 23rd, cultural preservation and economic development on March 9th, migration on March 23rd, disinformation and elections on April 6th, and youth engagement at the City Summit of the Americas on April 20th. Thank you all for being with us. Let me remind everyone the City Summit of the Americas for Youth application is now open. We encourage you, as we have, to apply at the citysummitoftheamericas.org website. So thank you, both of you, Willa Fortunoff, Ambassador Hachigian, for your participation today. I've certainly enjoyed the discussion. And thank all in our audience for attendance today, and I hope to see you at upcoming sessions.
Great.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Willow. Thank you, students.